I'm going to talk a bit about the Journal of Controversial Ideas and academic freedom. Yes, I think I have this microphone that should work. So I'm very grateful to be here to celebrate Jeff's career and to share this lot with Peter. About 1 year ago, Jeff and I were at Peter's retirement conference, and now I'm here with Peter, our Jeff retirement conference. I'm just sad that I'm not going to retire next year, but... So Jeff and Peter have been my role models and inspiration for years. I consider myself really privileged to have them as friends and as co-editors and co-founders of the Journal of Controversial Ideas. When in 2015 I started talking about starting a new journal dedicated to controversial ideas to Peter and Jeff, I was not really optimistic about the possibility that they would be interested in this project. Being involved in the Journal of Controversial Ideas was unlikely to win new friends and was likely to alienate people who already supported their work. But most importantly, it would have required a lot of time and energy. But Jeff and Peter are two extraordinarily generous people, and they agreed to take this risky adventure. So 6 years later, in April 21, we published the first issue of the Journal of Controversial Ideas. And to me, this was a dream coming true. Maybe to them was kind of like the beginning of a nightmare, but nevertheless. We'll soon publish our 10th issue, and we haven't yet received a single death threat as editor of the journals, and we haven't been under investigations by our university, so it's been a great success. And at least they got away with it. They're retired, so maybe we'll see what happens to me. But so for those who are not familiar with this journal, it's a multidisciplinary, peer-reviewed, and most importantly, open access journal that publishes papers unlikely to be published elsewhere because of the controversy they might stir. One unique feature of the Journal of Controversial Ideas is that we allow authors to publish under a pseudonym. We offer this option to people who are concerned about possible negative consequences as being subject to petitions, to be fired or paper retracted, to be under investigation, and so on. And we also allow the authors to later reveal their identity, so we update the paper if they want to use the real name. And I'll elaborate on the journal shortly, but first I'd like to touch upon how controversy has been a defining theme of Jeff's career. I think this reveals something crucial about Jeff's approach to philosophy. An approach that should be the gold standard of academia, but that's a bit less common now. And I think you can see in his willingness to tackle difficult questions that others avoid, and his commitment to following arguments where they lead. You can see this approach. So I'll mention just a few examples, but I'm sure each of you can mention other ones. As you all know, Jeff has written about the moral permissibility of infanticide and the replaceability of newborns. And he has argued that perhaps we should arrange the gradual extinction of carnivorous species, replacing them with the herbivorous ones. In an open ad for the New York Times that he co-authored with Peter, he argued that people with cerebral palsy and severe cognitive disabilities might enjoy sexual acts they cannot give explicit consent to. And they would be incapable of understanding that they might have been harmed or wronged. Jeff has also argued against the boycotting of Israeli academics, despite being very critical of Netanyahu. In 2019, he was not platformed by students at Beirut University who objected to him giving a talk at the university simply because Jeff was an advisor to the Center for Moral and Political Philosophy at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, this despite his well-known critical views on Israel policy. Jeff's approach to philosophy is careful, fair-minded, objective, non-emotional, and unselfish. He approaches every topic with an open mind, with genuine interest in finding an answer and not in promoting a certain moral or political view. But if to some philosopher this means never taking a stand about anything and just tiptoeing around controversial issues without ever really saying anything substantial, Jeff is not worried about clearly stating the sometimes uncomfortable conclusions he has reached. Whilst his approach to philosophy is non-emotional, he feels strongly about many issues. For example, his indignation is evident when people are treated unjustly. Indeed, Jeff has also been very supportive of various academics who got into trouble and signed counter-petitions to oppose those calling for the firing of academics who would express ideas considered controversial. This includes not only people he agreed with or considered friends, but also those with quite different views from his own. And with respect to the journal Controversial Ideas, I can tell you that we have published some articles we disagree with. But we didn't start this journal to promote certain views, but to promote a debate on difficult questions. And I think this is perfectly in line with what Jeff has done throughout his career. So let's get back to the journal Controversial Ideas. How did it start? So back in 2015, we began noticing a troubling trend in academia. There were petitions demanding academics be fired, papers retracted, editors dismissed, guest speakers disinvited or not platformed, editorial members abandoning journals following controversial publication, academic facing investigations, suspensions, other punishments. Nowadays, we are used to hear that somebody is under investigation, but it was not the norm 10 years ago, good old times. In 2017, for instance, Rebecca Tuvell's paper on transracialism caused a huge controversy. There were petitions to have the paper retracted, and part of the editorial board of Hypatia, which is the journal where it was published, criticized the decision to publish the paper and left the editorial board. In 2017, again, Bruce Gilley's article, The Case for Colonialism, was published in an advanced online version of the Third World Quarterly, but following protest, and I think also death threats to the editor, it was retracted. This controversy generated even more controversy because Nigel Biggar, here at Oxford University, supported Gilley and became himself the subject of an open letter. And just next door in Cambridge in 2019, Noah Carl was investigated after 500 academics signed a letter complaining about his recent appointment as a research fellow. Only 5 years later, another college at Cambridge rescinded Nathan Kaufner's affiliation. And both Carl and Kaufner argued that it should be permissible to conduct research on group IQ differences, which is one of the most controversial topics in academia. But, according to a database published by FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression in the US, scholars most often come under fire for speech about race, 39% of these episodes. And 1,080 scholars sanctioned attempts occurred between 2000 and 2022. The annual number of attempts has increased dramatically over time, was 4 in 2000 and 145 in 2022. 65% of attempts resulted in sanction, including 255 terminations, so people get fired, 255. And 73% of these terminations involved untenured scholars. And right now, we are witnessing how critical views on Israel are triggering a new wave of censorship, firings, and demotions, particularly among American academics. In these cases, the pressure is coming from government bodies, whereas in the example I mentioned before, it was coming from other academics. But regardless of where the pressure to silence certain voices and opinions comes from, and regardless of whose voices or which opinion it aims at silencing, it represents a fundamental threat to academic freedom. A lot of people suddenly turn into academic freedom champions when it's those they agree with who find themselves in trouble. I'm afraid it doesn't work like that. We either defend the right to academic freedom for everyone, including the ones whose views we might find abhorrent, or we are not entitled to invoke academic freedom when it is most convenient to us. We don't get to choose who deserves academic freedom. It's everybody or nobody. When we launched the journal Controversial Ideas, many ask, what's so bad about censorship? Why should we prioritize academic freedom over people's feelings, or even attempts at bringing about some improvements with respect to social justice? These are very reasonable questions. And I'll briefly explain why I think academic freedom should be universities' priority and why it should be absolute within the limits of the law. By that, I mean academic freedom doesn't provide a free pass for plagiarism, data fabrication, libel slander, or incitement to violence. But apart from these exceptions, there should be no other limit. And here's why. Academic freedom has instrumental value. It is this instrument through which we pursue truth and knowledge. Indeed, it is the only instrument we have to advance knowledge and get closer to the truth. So if we care about knowledge and truth, we must care about academic freedom. There are usually two types of rebuttal to this kind of argument. One is that the truth doesn't matter as much as goals such as promoting equality and causing no psychological distress, not offending people's sensitivity, and I'll get back to this shortly. The other one is that there is no truth. Truth is a social construct. As Ronald Dworkin already put it in the 90s, the very possibility of objective truth is now itself under challenge from an anti-truth squad of relativists, subjectivists, neo-pragmatists, postmodernists, and similar critics now powerful in the confident departments of American universities. According to these critics, academic freedom is not just bloodless, but fraudulent. I won't delve into philosophical arguments in support of objectivism, but I think it's important to acknowledge where this started, because that's the central philosophical battle worth fighting, in my opinion, over the next few years. But let me focus instead on why academic freedom and finding the truth matter more than not hurting people's feelings. People's feelings matter a lot. No good person will want to hurt someone's feeling gratuitously. How do you say that? But we can clearly see that it's impossible to have an intellectually honest conversation without ever hurting anyone's feelings. Potentially anything can be considered offensive by different groups or by different individuals. What was considered non-offensive, even just in the 90s, is considered offensive now. What is considered offensive in one country might not be considered offensive in another. I remember talking with Jeff about the attempted cancellation of Dr. Seuss, the children's book author. Our sensibilities change, and so does what we consider funny or offensive. We recently published in the journal Controversial Ideas a paper that was considered controversial by other journals because it was a defense of meritocracy. I think we're all quite surprised to realize merit is now considered controversial. The list of what is considered controversial and offensive is getting longer and longer. It would be practically difficult, if not actually impossible, to teach a course without ever touching on a controversial topic. And perhaps, as educators, we should teach students to deal with topics and arguments they find offensive rather than trying to protect them from what makes them uncomfortable. I would like to think of university not as echo chambers that protect students from discomfort, but as places where ideas are rigorously challenged and intellectual fears are conquered. But most importantly, I believe we should be cautious before dismissing the importance of knowledge and truth too quickly. Moral and material progress in human history is the result of a constant exchange of ideas, many of which were initially considered abhorrent. By suppressing this debate, we hinder future progress. Without academic freedom, without the freedom to exchange of ideas, it's much harder, perhaps impossible, to discover the truth about the world's most important questions. The problem is not much that one individual is fired, or even that 100 people will have to change the research line. The problem is that entire lines of research will be paused or perhaps even brought to an end. And if this happens, we move farther away from understanding the world. And this is going to affect all of us. Once we understand how the world works, we can hopefully intervene to improve what we don't like. We can make it better. But then knowledge, the power to change comes at the price of first understanding how things are. There is a lot at stake, and our success depends on our freedom to ask difficult questions and pursue answers where they lead. One of our concerns was that because of fear of being investigated or fired, academics would start censoring themselves and keeping the results of their inquiries to themselves. And when not censored by their own fear, they will be censored by journals that refuse to publish papers that can stir a controversy. This climate has a chilling effect on various members of academia, researchers who don't feel free to explore controversial topics, professors who are worried about teaching controversial ideas, editors who don't feel like publishing controversial papers, and students who are not exposed to controversial ideas and therefore don't learn how to engage with ideas they disagree with. But the effect of these chilling effects extend to society at large because it's at universities the future teachers, administrators, accountants learn how to deal with ideas they might disagree with and to learn to think critically. Now, I don't think the problem is people, students, and academics signing petition and requesting that someone be fired because they have dared to say something controversial, or that an article be retracted because they don't want certain ideas to be circulated. I personally find it immoral to try to ruin someone's life just because they think differently from me, but I recognize that people have a right to behave in such a way. It's their freedom of speech. However, the real problem, I believe, are academic institutions, our universities, which have repeatedly failed at protecting the fundamental principle on which this entire enterprise called academia should be based on. And this is academic freedom. As Fritz Mackleb already put it in the 90s, so people are talking a lot about this in the 90s already, talking about administrators dealing with controversial academics. He said, if those who control a professor employment attempt to place any metes and bounds whatsoever to academic freedom, there is no academic freedom. Within the limits imposed by the law of the land, it is absolute, or it is non-existent. The 4 trustees and presidents must interpose themselves between a justly outraged community and individuals whom they don't respect. They must at least condone platform behavior which fills them with disgust. They must allow their institutions to be disgraced and derided. These things they must do for the sake of a cause which often seems very remote and abstract, and which the public does not understand. It is a hard assignment. End of quote. It is a hard assignment indeed, and most university administrators have badly failed at this, especially over the past 10 years. The problem is that when we hinder the pursuit of truth, we cause long-term damage, and the consequence could be very serious. Academic freedom matters, I think, also because it is part of our job description. It is not just a privilege. It is the basic principle we're required to embrace and to commit to as academics. We have the duty to seek the truth, even when it poses risks to our careers, even when embracing the dominating ideology would be so much more convenient. When everybody around us keeps repeating that 2 + 2 = 5, we have not just a moral duty, but a professional obligation to keep repeating that it is not true. Peter will talk about free speech in a moment, but I'll briefly say a word about the distinction between free speech and academic freedom. I think academic freedom implies more duties and responsibilities than free speech does. As a citizen, free speech grants me the right to say whatever I want within the limits that Peter will discuss. But as a certified expert on a certain topic, that is, as an academic, I get paid to write and teach what I think is true after careful inquiry and investigation. I think academic freedom implies, contrary to free speech, a duty to share the truth I have discovered with other people. I'm not supposed to keep these truths to myself. I have a duty to share. That's what I get paid for. One might object that it's true that academia's primary tellers is being producing knowledge of what is true, but universities should really move to become centers for promoting social justice, equality, inclusion, rather than places where people teach and research the truth. I don't think this change would be beneficial. There are other places devoted to the promotion of certain ideas and principles, such as churches, political parties, think tanks, and so on. These are great institutions doing very important work. But academia is different and serves a different purpose. If academia doesn't pursue its own purpose, it will become redundant and will disappear. Some might say this would be a good outcome, but I disagree. Unless AI becomes AGI and starts telling us what is true without us having to figure it out ourselves, I don't see how we can make progress or survive future challenges without people invested in the search for truth and knowledge. It's not just a matter of principle, it's a practical one. Things could go very badly if people building aeroplanes or performing brain surgery have not been taught objective truth about maths and biology. The list could continue and be very long, but you get the idea. I really don't think we're doing our future selves and future generation a favor by stripping academia of what has been its telos for hundreds of years. And now to conclude, what Jeff has done in these first 40 years of his career has been exactly this kind of work. His commitment to the ideals of truth-seeking, intellectual honesty, and curiosity are the reasons why we are celebrating him today. They're here to celebrate a person who has always said what he believed to be true, who never shied away from controversy, who never chose his reputation over his commitment to academic freedom. I find this inspiring, and I'm grateful that his courage has paved the way for other academics to find in themselves the courage to seek the truth and to do their job. Thank you.
Okay, so now Peter Singer, no stranger to controversy.
Thanks very much. And I want to say how glad I am to be able to be present at Jeff's retirement, at an event to honor him. When Jeff came to Princeton, I went to Princeton in 1999. Jeff came as a visiting fellow, I think in 2003. Must have been just before your appointment to Rutgers, right? And that certainly was, to me, it was great to have somebody who was working in practical ethics at such a high level in the neighborhood. It's probably not well known that I was appointed to the University Center for Human Values, which in a way was a kind of end run around the conservatism of the philosophy department at Princeton at the time, which still had the attitude that practical ethics isn't really philosophy. So there weren't people doing practical ethics in the philosophy department. That changed fairly soon and came later. But it was terrific to have Jeff there as a visitor. I greatly admired his book, The Ethics of Killing at the Margins of Life. And we discussed that quite a lot in the time that he was there. He was then again at Princeton some years later. So Jeff became a great friend and a terrific colleague to have around, and I want to thank him for all of the excellent discussions we had and all of the things that I learned from him. And also, of course, I want to thank him for supporting this Journal of Controversial Ideas, as Francesca mentioned, which was originally her idea, but I think it was important that we both worked with that. Again, that was, I think, a decision that required some courage. I was aware of the controversy of the possible hazards because I'd been involved in some controversies about that before, as I'll say in a few moments. So it was a real comfort to have Jeff joining me in that venture. Right. So what are the limits to free speech? Freedom of speech in general, and academic freedom in particular, have traditionally in democratic societies been causes championed by progressives against conservatives who've tried to limit the expression of radical ideas. So John Stuart Mill is an example, a great 19th century advocate of freedom of thought and discussion, was of course a utilitarian reformer, defending freedom against conservative views that the state is entitled to protect public morals and to protect the religion on which those morals were widely supposed to rest. And similarly in the United States during the 20th century, attacks on free speech most often targeted socialists, communists, advocates of free love like Bertrand Russell, and of course in the South, believers in evolution. I had my own experience of attacks on academic freedom from the right when I was appointed to Princeton in 1999. Steve Forbes was a member of the Princeton Board of Trustees His father had endowed the university's Forbes College, had been a major donor, and he was also running for the Republican nomination for president, a nomination that George W. Bush, in fact, obtained. But there were some concerns, I think he had some concerns, that as a member of the Board of Trustees, his chances of getting that nomination would be reduced if he simply accepted my appointment, and so he called on it to be rescinded and pledged that he would not donate to the university as long as I was on the faculty. The Board of Trustees, gave him no support, fortunately, on that, nor did the president of the university. But he and Republicans generally were opposed to my support for abortion and for euthanasia, especially for suggesting that parents should have the option of euthanasia for their severely disabled newborns. The pattern of conservative hostility to free speech continued into the present century to some extent. In 2014, the University of Illinois withdrew an offer of appointment to Stephen Sekyra because he posted tweets that were highly critical of Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu, tweets we might today regard as prophetic. During Trump's first term, Harvard's Kennedy School withdrew Chelsea Manning's appointment as a visiting fellow and cancelled a lecture she'd been scheduled to give when the then CIA Director Mike Pompeo called her a traitor. In the first quarter of the present century, however, in many parts of the world, the most vigorous operation to freedom of speech has come from people on the left. At Middlebury College in Vermont, protesters shouted down Charles Murray, co-author of the controversial book The Bell Curve about race and IQ. And outside the universities, James Darmore, a software engineer at Google, was fired after he circulated a memo suggesting there may be differences between men and women that could explain, in part, why there are fewer women than men in his particular field of work, software engineering. And as Francesca has indicated, there were many more such incidents, and they are continuing. But it was predictable that the pendulum would eventually swing in the other direction, although perhaps it was not predictable that what has happened after Trump's re-election is how fast and hard it has swung. The Trump administration has withheld grants to universities that have sought to respect the freedom of their students to protest against actions of the government of Israel, actions that, incidentally, Jeff has plausibly argued to be indefensible. And the Trump administration has expanded the definition of anti-Semitism, in my view, illegitimately, to include anti-Zionism, and has withheld grants to universities that have sought to respect their freedom of students to protest that. The Trump administration has also now, and other Republican state governments, have sought to tell universities what they should teach in courses that discuss, for example, racism and how we should respond to it. It's regrettable, therefore, that conservatives failed to take a principled stand against cancel culture and failed to defend freedom of thought and expression when those who were dismissed or had positions withdrawn from them espoused views that the progressives did not favour. And that fact, I think, has made it very difficult for progressives now to take a convincing stand against the restrictions on freedom of thought and expression that are coming once again from the right. Some will argue that the restrictions of freedom of speech by the right are different from those by restrictions of freedom of speech by the left because the restrictions by the right have attempted to silence those who are opposing grave injustices, whereas the restrictions advocated by the left are justifiable because they're intended to protect disadvantaged and marginalised groups from the harm inflicted by racist, sexist, homophobic or ableist speech. So what should we think about that response? I just said that Steve Forbes and other conservatives opposed my appointment at Princeton University. But that is, in fact, only part of the story. Some of the opposition came from the left, from groups claiming to represent people with disabilities. These groups accused me of ableism because of those views about allowing parents the option of euthanasia for severely disabled newborns. And the accusation of ableism resurfaces relatively frequently. For example, during the COVID pandemic, Rebecca Tuval, whose article on transracialism Francesca just mentioned, invited me to give an online talk about pandemic ethics at Rhodes College, where she teaches. Some academics in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology, in the Africana Studies Department program, and in the Department of History called for the invitation to be withdrawn because of my eugenicist views, it's in quotes, eugenicist views, on permitting euthanasia for severely disabled infants, and said that my position, quote, denies the very humanity of people with disabilities. I replied by inviting those academics to state their position on abortion following prenatal testing that reveals a severe disability, on the right of parents to decide, in conjunction with the medical advisors, to withdraw life support from an infant in hospital with a severe disability, knowing that the withdrawal of that life support would lead to the infant's death, and on vaccinating girls against rubella, which is not in itself a serious condition, but which, of course, increases the likelihood that they will have a disabled child when they conceive. These choices all seek to prevent the existence of a child with a disability and hence express the same attitude to having a child with a serious disability as a parent's choice to end the life of a newborn infant with that disability. I don't accept the distinction between allowing to die and causing death, on which, for example, that distinction between withdrawing life support and providing the means to end the child's life humanely rests. If preferring to have a child without a severe disability is ableist or eugenicist, then some forms of ableism and eugenicism are not only very widely held positions, but they're positions that I consider to be justifiable. This doesn't show, I believe, hostility or disrespect for people with disabilities, let alone challenge their humanity, and they're entirely compatible with laws that prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities in areas such as education, employment, and housing, laws that I support. Terms like eugenicist and ableist are frequently used as terms of abuse with very little thought. The same can be said of the term transphobic. I write a monthly column for Project Syndicate. The column I wrote after Trump's election last November referred to the fact that the Trump campaign spent millions, I think in fact tens of millions of dollars on ads attacking Kamala Harris for authorizing, when she was Attorney General of California, the use of public funds to provide a sex change operation for a prisoner convicted of murder. The Trump campaign believed that these ads were highly effective in influencing voters against Harris. Some Democrats concerned about the ads thought that Harris should dissociate herself from the decision she had made, which was then many years in the past. Given that there were far more important issues at stake in the election than whether public funds should be used for sex change operations for people in prison, I supported that view in my column. When I posted about the column on Blue Sky, some people suggested that I was transphobic, even though I was careful to state in the article that I was not taking sides on whether public funds should be used for sex change operations for convicts, but rather was saying that the importance of keeping Trump out of office overwhelmed the importance of that question. Then one of my critics posted that they had gone through the Journal of Controversial Ideas and found that 23% of the articles we published were transphobic. Now, it may be true that 23% of the articles we then published were on trans issues. I haven't checked it, but it's possible. The journal has received a lot of submissions on trans issues, and I think the obvious reason for that is that even well-reasoned and well-argued papers on this topic have difficulty in finding journals that will publish them. The more important point, however, is that to argue against views widely supported by trans people in a paper that has passed our editorial scrutiny and has been recommended for publication by our reviewers is not evidence that the author has a phobia about trans people. Similarly, last October, we published a paper entitled Intelligence of Refugees in Germany, Levels, Differences, and Possible Determinants. The article claimed that the average IQ of refugees in Germany coming from Middle Eastern, Central Asian, and African countries is about 12 points below the German average, and that this is likely to affect their suitability for certain kinds of employment. We put the paper through a lengthy review process, which resulted in some revisions being made. Some reviewers sent it back for revision, and revisions were made. But in the end, the reviewers recommended acceptance of the revised version. We were concerned that publication of the paper might be used to support objections to a practice that, within some limits, we support, namely accepting refugees. Nevertheless, Francesca, Jeff, and I thought that it was better to publish the paper and at the same time invite some others who'd taken contrary views to the line being defended in the paper to respond to it, rather than to refuse to publish it for that reason, for the reason being that we opposed or were worried about the possible effects of publishing the paper, and then not allow a discussion from which we might learn something about the topic investigated, and of course we might learn through the commentators that we'd invited to comment why those arguments might not be as strong as the authors of the paper maintain. The publication of this paper and of some of the papers we've published on transgender issues may cause offence to minority groups such as refugees from those named countries and trans people. Is this a sufficient reason against publishing them? We think not, and in support of that view, I repeat Mill's argument in On Liberty that causing offence is not a sufficient reason for restricting free speech. Francesca has already touched on this, and I agree. There are so many different ways in which people can take offence that to allow freedom of expression to be restricted whenever it causes offence would justify restricting almost any kind of serious speech, proposed changes in accepted ideas. As Mill argued, if we're to discover the truth on controversial questions and to prevent known truths from becoming dead dogmas, freedom of speech is essential, and in the long run, its value outweighs the harms of offence. We must be able to challenge conventional beliefs and values and to encourage others to ask themselves how they ought to live. To do this properly, we need a licence to cause offence. Nevertheless, Mill thought that there are some limits on free speech. Quote, even opinions lose their immunity when the circumstances in which they are expressed are such as to constitute their expression a positive instigation to some mischievous act. End of quote. That sentence immediately precedes his oft-quoted distinction between publishing in a newspaper one's opinion that corn dealers starve the poor and saying the same to an excited mob in front of a corn dealer's house. Although angry mobs can still assemble outside the houses of people they consider wrongdoers, and occasionally do, it's more common today for incitement to take place in social media posts. And it isn't always clear where to draw the line. Last year, tragically, 3 girls were murdered at a dance workshop in Southport, in the UK. And a false rumour spread on social media that the murderer was an immigrant. Lucy Connolly, a 41-year-old who worked as a childminder and had apparently heard and believed the false rumour, published the following message online. Mass deportation now. Set fire to all the fucking hotels full of the bastards for all I care. If that makes me racist, so be it. At the time, she had 9,000 followers on Twitter The message was reposted 940 times, and in the next 3 hours it was viewed more than 300,000 times. Then she deleted it. She was charged with inciting racial hatred and pled guilty. She was sentenced to 31 months imprisonment. She appealed, claiming that the sentence was manifestly excessive, and last month her appeal was rejected. In this case, there was incitement to racial hatred, and there was explicit incitement to violence. So for me, this falls outside the pale of accepted free speech. I think the conviction was appropriate. I also think, though, that the sentence was excessive, especially given that Connolly had deleted her post when she realised how widely it was spreading. Here's a case that falls on the other side of the line I wish to draw. In 2022, Hampshire police arrested a man for malicious communication because he posted the LGBT pride flag by reshaping it into a swastika. In arresting the man, a police officer said, and this was recorded by somebody else on video, and you can find it on X, "Someone has been caused anxiety based on your social media post, and that is why you're being arrested." Another man, the man who filmed this, was also arrested for obstructing arrest. The Hampshire Constabulary had issued a graphic warning people against malicious communication, which it said relates to the sending of indecent, offensive, or threatening letters, electronic communication, or articles with the intent to cause the recipient distress or anxiety. The graphic states that this is a criminal offence which could result in prosecution and a criminal record. After the man was arrested, however, Hampshire Police and Crime Commissioner Donna Jones expressed concern about the proportionality and necessity of the police's response, saying, "When incidents on social media receive 2 visits from police officers, but burglaries and non-domestic break-ins don't always get a police response, something is wrong." And as far as I can see from media reports, the man was released without being charged. So I agree in that case that I don't think the man should have been arrested in the first place, but I agree that he should not have been charged, and that this mockery, perhaps, of the LGBT pride flag, offensive as it may be, and not at all something that I would support, nevertheless falls within the bounds of legitimate speech, or legitimate, I don't know if it's speech, whatever you call it. Consistently with the distinction Mill was trying to draw, I believe that the right of free speech does not extend to a right to incite racial or religious hatred, or hatred against people because of their sexual orientation, or because they choose to identify as being of a gender that differs from their biological sex. Especially when such vilification is accompanied by an incitement to violence, it can reasonably be prohibited. And in some cases, even if there isn't an incitement to violence, but the situation is one in which it may likely to be to inflame passions and feelings so that there is an increase in violence, I think it can reasonably be prohibited. But in the interest of freedom of thought and expression, I think criminal prosecution should be reserved for extreme cases that will, hopefully, be rare. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Jimmy Goodrich.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. First of all, I actually wanted to follow up on Alec Wallen's anecdote. In 2012, when I met Jeff, he was still saying that people didn't read his work. At the time, a peer of mine asked why he thought that, and Jeff replied, "Well, I don't get any death threats." So I was gonna wish you some death threats in your retirement, Jeff, but I don't have tenure, so I'll avoid that. Okay, so I'm not going to really object to much that was said here. Instead, I just want to complicate the discussion a little bit on the question of the limits of free speech. And apologies ahead of time, this is not a topic I work on or frankly have read much about, so I may be reinventing the wheel here in a bad way. Okay, so when I think about the limits of a right, usually at least three sorts of things come to mind. One is the strength of the interest one has in that right, or that grounds that right. So the strength of the interest in this case in our free expression, right? So I think one thing that came up in the discussion here is this may actually vary by context a little bit. In an academic context of a certain kind or in a certain kind of institutional setting, you may have a stronger interest than it is sort of standing out in a park just muttering one's beliefs about the nature of morality. Okay, another thing is the costs to limiting that speech to the speaker themselves, right? So the kinds of costs we've been discussing so far are things like criminalization, punishment, firing, other kinds of sanctions at the university level. But we might consider lesser ones as well. A third thing is the cost to others, the kinds of harms that might be visited upon others, injustices that may be visited upon others. And it seems plausible to me anyway to think how we draw the line of acceptable free speech may in some way depend upon all three of these factors. So a kind of natural way to think, I think, is that there's a kind of proportionality relation in the background here. So to illustrate that a little bit, I imagine that I might have told a really embarrassing story about Jeff today here at this conference. And this actually would have pained him. He wouldn't have just been sort of offended in a kind of indignant way. He would have sort of genuinely be pained. I might have told Larry that I was going to tell this horribly embarrassing anecdote, and Larry might make me feel bad about my intention to do so. He might shame me a little bit. Well, I take it that's some small amount of harm I would suffer, the shame of my former advisor, wagging his finger at me. I might feel a little bit bad. But it seems to me, even if this was a minor offense to Jeff at the end of the day, maybe this is entirely appropriate. So it may be that if the costs to me are sufficiently small and the costs to Jeff are sufficiently great, actually offenses can be a limit of free speech. Now, this, I take it, is a very different sort of case than all of the cases we've had in mind so far. The cases we've had in mind are far more dramatic ones of criminalization, of speech that maybe just offends, and of firings, people losing their livelihoods. So I don't take this point about proportionality to suggest anything like Peter and Francesca's remarks are wrong. I only take it to suggest the story might be a little more complicated. So, and that's if you agree with that case. I'm actually unsure what to think about that. Maybe at the end of the day, Larry can't shame me, and I'm allowed to tell the embarrassing anecdote. Now, we might follow up with a couple of other points here. It may be that the proportionality relation itself is not held fixed, but depends upon the institutional context. So it might be that what's proportionate in the case of me teaching a class is not the same as it is in a park in New York. Maybe I've spent too much time in New York, but people told me to shut the fuck up all the time on the street there. Seems entirely appropriate. And yet, in a classroom, I think maybe that would constitute a kind of wrongful sanction, though I may be saying the exact same thing. Similarly, we might wonder whether these proportionality constraints are sort of internal to the right in question or external, so that there would be a kind of lesser evil justification for restraining these rights. But these are all sort of complications I'll set to the side now. Okay, so it seems to me the story might be a little bit more complicated about what the interests are of the right holder, what they can cause to others, and what we can appeal to the cost to others in order to justify limiting their speech. So with that, I'll just make a couple of quick particular remarks. First, on Francesca, there was one objection she considered, which was that universities should be centers for the promotion of social justice rather than truth, right? And she replied to this by arguing that that's not true. They should be centers for the exploration of truth. I'll just register that I worry there's a bit of a false dilemma here. If I was actually convinced that there was a pretty grave injustice that would be committed by me uttering some truth, I'm not so sure I would be allowed to say it. Now, in fact, I sort of wonder whether that's really the case. Instead, it seems to me maybe we should contest the conception of justice that's being appealed to here. So once again, we might even find in that a kind of justification for why it is, the difference between the two cases of me in the park and me in the classroom, actually, I can't be sanctioned in the same kind of way. So here's what I mean. So going back to the 19th century, it was often thought that justice or other moral aims were the fundamental justification for expanding education to many people. This was a preoccupation of many of those same people who defended free speech, like Bentham and Mill. Because of that, we might think actually there is a tradition of thinking the moral aims of education perhaps do bear on the question. But in those cases, those moral aims may end up raising the bar on, or lowering the bar on what can be done to me as an academic attempting to educate. So that's just a sketch. That may not work out. It may turn out that Francesca's way of going is better, but I would be sort of attempted to appeal to the very justification of the university and its moral aims rather than the instrumental aims of truth in order to justify why the restrictions, in fact, were not there on my teaching. Okay, now to Peter, there was the two cases at the end, the one of the inciting racial violence and then the case of the swastika pride flag. Peter sees a distinction between these two cases. I'm inclined to agree. It seems to me that those two cases are quite different. But in trying to think about what exactly the difference consisted in, I struggled a little bit. So the story we were offered was there was positive incitement in one case, but not the other. I guess I'm not entirely sure what positive incitement amounts to. So on one view, it might just amount to making it more likely that violence will occur. Of course, part of this depends upon what other people's attitudes are who might see these things. It could be, I take it, that there was a higher probability that the flag would end up inciting violence. I'm not sure, but it's unclear whether or not we think merely the probabilities there are what's doing the work. Now, you might instead try and appeal to a kind of intention-foresight distinction, saying, well, one kind of speech seems to reveal an intention to impose these risks while the other doesn't, except both cases seem entirely compatible to me with the idea that they both could merely foresee the risks being imposed, but neither intended them. So that doesn't obviously make a huge difference, as far as I could tell. A different kind of view would just be one that was conventional. These words, conventionally, we think, tend to lead to this kind of outcome, and because of that, we're going to prohibit it in the one case rather than the other. So this might be a kind of expected utility story about the constraints on using certain sorts of words. But this sort of brings it back to the original discussion of which values we should be weighing up and limiting the speech in the first place, because that's what's going to justify the convention that then limits the speech. So appealing to the convention itself didn't obviously seem to resolve what the limits were in either case. So this is not to suggest that the two cases are in fact the same. I think they're probably not. It was merely to suggest I'm actually less sure what the limits on speech are supposed to look like after these talks, though I very much appreciated and admired them both. Thank you.
Thanks. I just want to ask one quick question of all three of you before opening it up to the audience. This is a question about offence and harm. So on the traditional Millian view, causing offence isn't harming somebody. But we've got a more sophisticated psychology than John Stuart Mill. We know that you really can harm people, damage them psychologically, which means damaging them physically, actually, with certain kinds of speech acts. And so that clear-cut distinction between offence and harm doesn't really hold. Are you saying, yes, I accept that, but it's never sufficiently harmful to curb speech? Or are you saying something different?
It's true that some kind of speech can be harmful. Somebody can come here and insult me and probably wouldn't enjoy that. But we would have to I mean, we would have to see how this applies to the context of academic freedom, for instance. So is there some research? Like, research is not really offensive in the sense it's aimed at one person, right? There is no insult in a paper to a precise person. So in that sense, you know, if the person is taking it personally, well, in a way, it's kind of their problem. I think also, like, you know, a very offensive paper shouldn't pass peer review. So I think that's, you know, that's why I'm more interested in academic freedom, because we have tools to prevent some kind of like purely offensive speech to end up in an academic paper. But also, you know, I think some level of being exposed to that helps with immunity. So, like, you know, Jeff didn't get death threats. I got so many. And after the first 10, I was fine. So, you know, I built some immunity to that. So maybe that, you know, that applies to offense as well.
Yeah, just to comment on the same question. I'm inclined to think that, well, certainly my initial reaction is that the distinction is what Francesca just said, that, you know, I remember saying from my childhood when people used to say bad things to you in the schoolyard, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. Now, I agree that that's not quite true, right? But there is a sense in which, you know, if people use sticks and stones against you, you are going to get physically hurt and there's nothing you can do about it. There is, for most people, most of the time, I think, there is a sense in which if people say nasty things about you, insult you, say offensive things against you, you can develop an attitude that means that these don't hurt me either. And I've certainly, like Francesca, had my share of that abuse, and I've developed a thicker skin. But of course, it's true that there are some people who have mental health concerns who may be very seriously hurt by certain kinds of speech. And I think if somebody was deliberately targeting somebody who they knew to be mentally fragile in that way, I might have a different view about it. Now, Francesca was saying, well, she was talking about academic speech, so academic papers don't target particular people, typically, anyway. Or I guess sometimes philosophers, actually, yeah, I mean, philosophers can be targeting other people in quite nasty view. What was that title of your paper about Brad Hooker you mentioned yesterday, Larry? Wrong, 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 and wrong? Yeah, my paper. Oh, it was your paper, Jeff, was it? So, right, yeah, okay. Yeah, anyway. I mean, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I know colleagues from other academic disciplines who for some reason or other have been at a philosophy seminar and have been astonished at how strongly we criticize each other in philosophy. But, yeah, but normally that doesn't happen. But if you were, in a way, singling out somebody, trying to cause them serious distress by the words you were using, even if in some way, you know, in a different context, those words might be protected speech, that could be something for which maybe you are committing some kind of offence and could be stopped. So I don't disagree with that.
Do you have any thoughts on this, Jimmy?
It would just be to reiterate something I said, which is, I guess I was thinking about it in terms of proportionality. There may be some small harm here, which may then mean there some small harm is appropriate or possibly appropriate to impose on somebody, but you're never going to get to the level, I think, of firing somebody, them losing their livelihood, going to prison, these kinds of things. So I guess I was willing to say offenses can be harmful, but we appeal to the proportionality calculation to explain why these other things are not appropriate sanctions.
Brilliant. Let's open this to questions.
Can
Sorry.
we get a chance to respond to what Jimmy said before?
Yeah, okay. So,
do you want
go
to
for it.
respond to what he said?
But not at too great a length, because there are going to be quite a few questions.
Good, okay, I'll be brief. Right, so what's the difference between what makes something a positive incitement to violence? What if there's a higher probability that the swastika version of the LGBT flag would incite violence than Lucy Connolly's post? Well, if that really was the situation and the person was aware of it and did it intentionally, maybe then there is something wrong. But so I think that my short answer is I think there is an intention-foresight distinction. But with Lucy Connolly's tweet. I mean, you know, she's basically saying you should burn down the hotels in which refugees are housed. I think that's a pretty explicit incitement to violence.
Okay, keep the questions brief and the answers relatively brief because
Okay, thank you very much. As you know, I support your work very much, and especially amazing work you're doing with the journal, even though I haven't done much. But I would like Jimmy, I'm interested in this kind of limits. And Francesca, you talk about the freedom of research. Now, I would like you to reflect a bit more about that, because it seems to me completely kosher that, for example, a university can decide we're not only in the pursuit of truth, we also want to promote, for example, peace or social justice, something like that. Actually, there are universities like the Ritz-American in Kyoto, because of the history, they decided, we should focus on promoting peace. Moreover, it seems to me, legitimate that a state could decide in an enlightened democratic fashion, we're not going to do any research on, let's say, cluster bombs or maybe doomsday weapons or something like that. So there are clearly things that seems to be reasonable that you can have this kind of limits. So I wonder, where is the principle kind of, so to say, stop for that, where it's not acceptable for a state, for a democratic state to decide something like that, or for a university to decide, okay, we're going to be committed to certain kind of other causes than just truth.
Yeah, sorry. I don't think the state or the university should have any word about what kind of research an individual can and cannot do. That's completely up to them. That's the point of academic freedom. I think
seriously, I just want to know if you mean that. Since you can't, it's not the state can have views about that you should not work on some kind of bacteriological warfare that will kill all of humanity. They can't outlaw that.
I think there is some limit to, like, you cannot publish I think at some point a paper was published about how to make a bomb
for example,
home, right? That kind of example. I think that's the limit. Like, that's very dangerous. You cannot publish a paper explaining how to do that to, potentially everybody in the world. But, if you get a grant to work on how to
kill all of humanity? The state can't intervene in that? That seems absurd.
Okay,
of course they can.
But that's how academic freedom works. Like, that project wouldn't pass, right? Because you have peer review and referees that say, no, this is completely dangerous, it's completely useless, so we're not going to fund that kind of research. So you don't really get to that point. I can't see how that happens, because there is this gatekeeping within the profession, but you have to trust
I get funding from philanthropes. They can give me a lot of money for strange stuff.
Sorry, we don't want to have too many rallies going. Peter, do you have anything to comment on that?
So I do think that there are some kinds of research that should not be done, yes. And in fact, scientists will discuss that, right? This is research about capability of modifying viruses to give them wider capability, and some of the justification for that is that it may enable us to develop a vaccine to prevent it, but it's very dangerous research. And I think that it might be that I can imagine a lab that said, we're going to go ahead with this because they thought it was interesting and important, and a government might step in and say, you can't do that, it's too dangerous. So, I'm not sure whether we're disagreeing here, but I do think there can be such cases, but clearly narrow grounds.
Another question in the back row, or come down the row.
I wanted to ask about the focus on causing offence that kind of came throughout a lot of the talks. So, it seems to me maybe fine to say, sure, if this action or this paper, research, whatever, merely causes offence, then that might constitute a bad reason to violate academic freedom or freedom of speech or whatever. But presumably people are going to argue, well, no, there's much more than potential offence here. There's liability to harm. We've just had a question there about how the research into weapons could cause far more than offence. So is there not a risk of two things? One, I suppose, just sort of retreating to easy cases where we can merely limit harms to offence rather than, say, rises in hate crimes or refugees not being led into countries. That presumably causes much greater harm. And B, taking an overly pessimistic view of what academia can do. I mean, presumably a lot of us think that academic research does far more than make people feel good or bad.
Yeah. So I think we need to be aware of the possible harms that research can do and do our best to guard against that. But obviously one can't foresee all of the effects, both good and bad. So, I mean, on the one hand, you could say, well, we're not going to publish anything that might suggest that refugees have an average lower IQ than people of the country that is taking them. But it may be that the silence on that issue can be used by populist politicians to say that this information is being suppressed. It may be that people on the other side may accuse us of racism and say that the mere fact that the refugees are not getting jobs in certain areas of employment is evidence of racism and something needs to be changed. That was something like that thinking has been behind the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, and that might have bad effects. So it's difficult to work out what those effects are. And in general, I think, with perhaps the extreme exceptions that Gustav was talking about, I would think we want to try and find out the truth, and the way to find out the truth is to have open expression of ideas and allow other people to try to refute those ideas that they think might be wrong. So that's why I would say that we should still go ahead with that, even if we can anticipate the possibility of more serious harms occurring.
Yes, I think that also kind of answers the question, the point that Jimmy made. I'm kind of optimistic about the ultimate goal. I think that once we figure out how things are, that's when we can make things better. But, we have to go through this phase where we have to swallow the hard truth. And, I am a transhumanist. I'm very optimistic about the future, about the things we can do, we can change. I think we can do so much. But we need to understand how things work first. And, in the end, academic freedom has the goal of improving well-being, but it's in the long run. And I think it has been so already. We can see the progress been made, so, yeah.
Thanks very much. I found the talks very interesting. I suppose I'm still not clear exactly what the general principle is that's going to help to determine whether speech is protected or unprotected. So a lot of the unprotected cases involved incitement to violence, and the protected cases involved, I think your phrase was hurt feelings and your phrase was offense. You might just think, yeah, a little bit like the previous commenter said, those are basically the easy cases, and the really difficult cases are just basically in the middle. So you might think about things like the ways in which speech can affect people's social standing, their ability to, as it were, hold their heads high in a political community, relate to others on equal terms, questions about the social bases of people's self-respect, things that might be emotional harms, but more aptly describable as traumatic rather than merely offensive, and so on and so forth. Those seem to me like all of the relevantly difficult cases in the middle. And I'm just not clear what the general principle is that's going to, guide us through those cases. And you might just think, violence is where we draw the line. But to me, that seems a slightly strange position, because you might just think, well, why is violence so bad? Well, maybe it's bad because it's humiliating, or it makes you feel like you can't hold your head high in a political community anymore, and so on and so forth. But it's not like a fundamental fact of morality or political morality that we care about violence. But if it's not a fundamental fact, then you might just think all of those other kinds of difficult cases that I mentioned could have all of the same features that violence could have, especially when you realize that violence could vary in its severity. So I suppose my thought here is maybe we just need a more general theory with more general principles that can help us adjudicate particular cases rather than just focusing on some of the, as it were, easier cases on either side of the line, if that makes sense.
Is it up to Peter?
Yeah, either of you, yeah.
Well, maybe because I talked a bit more about Milan violence, I'll take that on. You said it's not a fundamental fact about morality that violence is bad. And obviously, as a consequentialist and a utilitarian, I have to agree with that. But then I don't think the discussion we're having today is about a fundamental fact about morality. I mean, some people may think that there is a fundamental fact about morality that gives us a line between what is acceptable speech and what isn't. I don't. I think it's more contingent on the facts, and I think Mill argued in that way too. He explicitly said he was arguing as a utilitarian. Some commentators have doubted that and suggested that he actually gives evidence of believing in some intrinsic principle of the importance of freedom and individuality. It's not clear to me that that reading of Mill is justified, though. I think you can defend the view that he was right when he said that he was arguing as a utilitarian. So we need to know what the facts are, and that's, of course, very difficult, always a problem for utilitarians in many complex situations. But I think both Francesca and I agreed that freedom of speech and academic freedom, freedom to research and publish, are likely to be conducive to, in the long run, a better society, a better world. And that means, for a utilitarian anyway, more happy, fulfilled lives, less pain and suffering. So, and I think when you get to violence and something that incites violence, that is obviously extremely negative from that utilitarian perspective. Partly the actual violence that might be inflicted if somebody had taken Lucy Connolly's post seriously and set fire to a hotel full of asylum seekers. But partly also because violence tends to breed more violence, and then you can get the collapse of societies, and then you get some dictatorship emerging, and all of that is very destructive of things that make for good lives.
Okay, under Elad's rule, we have just over 15 minutes, so can you keep the questions quite brief and keep the microphone moving down the rows now?
What role do you think universities will play in the future of controversial research, and particularly in philosophy, where basically the fact that no major university has a really great record on protecting free speech in the entire Western world suggests that there might be some tension between institutions and the rules of institutions and the activity of critically examining popular beliefs. Now, although academic philosophy has had some great successes, philosophy existed before academia, and even in the last few hundred years, some of what we now recognize to be the most important works in philosophy were done outside of the academy and institutional support. Now whenever I publish a controversial paper, there's always a campaign to fire the editors, to retract the paper, and then there's protests, and it just goes on and on. But of course, this wouldn't be, at least the paper wouldn't be retracted if it were published in JCI. But JCI, as important a role as it's playing, it can't be responsible for publishing all controversial work in academia. But you can just go post whatever you want on Substack, and then you don't have to have this endless discussion about and the free speech crises which go on and on. Now, of course, the university provides a paycheck, which and it's nice to be part of a community of scholars, but if it's not working as it's supposed to.
Can we get to the question, because there are a queue of people. All the questions are clustered in the front. All the keen questioners are in the front rows now. So, can you just get to the question very quickly, or respond to that?
I think we can. I think we understand what you're saying. You want to respond?
Yeah, I think. Thank you for the question. I think that, in part, as I was saying, the future of academia depends on its capacity to really stand by the principle of academic freedom. Otherwise, it will become redundant, it will disappear. Maybe it will disappear anyway because of AI, but I don't know. I mean, as it is now, I think it will just otherwise become something else. But I think that it's important, like you were saying, like people can publish on Substack, and so on and so forth, or on journals that don't have peer review. But I'm a big fan of peer review for the same reason I was saying to Gustav, in response to Gustav. I think it's important to have this gatekeeping that is from within the community, not from the church, not from the state, but from within the community. And peer review, when properly done, which is not always the case, but properly done, is really helpful in making sure that what is published is good quality and has passed this, you get the support of the community, because you say, okay, this is a peer-reviewed paper and people have, read it from my community, so I can defend this view, it's legitimate. But yeah. Sorry, I'm not sure if it looks completely clear what I wanted to say. But.
Hi there. Thanks a lot. So there's like an empirical question and a normative question. The normative question is like the framework. You could say if your speech is going to cause harm, then you need to justify the harm by reference to something. If you're a consequentialist, just do more good than harm. If you're a non-consequentialist, more to be said. So in the refugee case, you've got to point to some greater good if it really has resulted in a refugee not getting asylum and then getting tortured, for example. You're going to have to do a hell of a lot of good to justify that. So that's the normative flavor. And then there's this empirical question. And the empirical stuff, it seems like you just stopped at mill, but that was a long time ago. We've got all this kind of empirical kind of stuff going on now. It's like we know that the kind of environment that says when people say stuff and then people get to respond, the truth doesn't always come out. Because look at the US, where there was lots of that stuff that happened and then people believed tons of stuff that was blatantly false. So like the empirical data that we have to assess how different kinds of social environments lead to reinforcing the truth or reinforcing falsity is just much more complicated now. And the idea that you just rely on Mill and say, oh, that's what happens. People say X, someone else says Y, and then eventually the truth comes out. We know that's not true. So I'm a big defender of free speech, but I just think the empirical basis just has to be a lot stronger than just saying, let's just think about it in those kinds of terms. That's incredibly simplistic, given the complex social world and the complex world of communication that we now live in.
It depends a little bit what you mean by the truth comes out, I think, right? I mean, if you mean the truth comes out, if you mean everybody believes it, then obviously you're quite right. And social media has changed things because now we're in silos where, there's this group of people who believe this and they write posts to each other, and then there's some other group that believes that. And it's very hard to see how we change that. But if we're talking about academia, scientific research, peer-reviewed papers, I think truth does actually still come out from making it possible for views to be expressed, making it possible for other people to criticize them, gathering data, as Francesca says, peer review. I think that's maybe still, you may think of it as a 19th century kind of environment, but I think that still works that way.
Also, what is the alternative? Like we say, okay, well, then we'll never find out the truth. Let's just talk without trying to make any sense. I mean, that's the only alternative to trying to find the truth. We just give up on the truth. I can't see another way. I mean, that's the only option we have right now. Might not be the best. I said maybe AGI will help, but...
So may I pick up on a thread that Jimmy and you, Francesca, were talking about the purposes of the university. So you mentioned the possibilities of social justice promotion and other goods, and the search for truth and knowledge. But we're also teaching, right? And that's a massive part of it. And I feel uncomfortable about sending my students to be taught by people who've explicitly said they think those people are less clever, less worthy of teaching, which they might have thought, right? Because you might, in your pursuit of truth, come to the conclusion that some groups are not as smart enough to benefit from teaching, right? People have thought this in the past, they probably think it now. So if somebody in good faith came to that view, maybe they're not equipped to teach, even if they're equipped to do the research. And since the university pays people to teach as well, maybe that does bear on what they can do and whether they may be hired or fired.
I don't think there is any article which passed peer review that said a specific individual is not smart enough to teach. Groups, but groups, I mean, like, if we do the average of the intelligence of this group, will be different from the average intelligence of the other group. Does it mean that people in this room, each individual might not be smarter than another person in the other group? Doesn't mean that. And so this research on IQ differences in groups don't claim that.
I'm saying this is a possibility that's not ruled out by anything you're saying. But if you want to invoke, there are limits actually, which aren't about harm, they're about judgments about group, then fine, I might be with you, but you haven't invoked that.
I'm not sure how really a paper about a group can be like, this example, I come from the south of Italy, and some research shows that southern Italians have an average IQ 10 points lower than northern Italians. I still have a job at a northern Italian university. Nobody told me I'm not smart enough to teach. Even my group, I think I'm pretty smarter than some other people in the northern Italian group. That doesn't make me absolutely dumber than anybody who lives in the north. And I think this applies to all groups' differences. I can live with that. I can live with that research.
We're working through you don't need to put your hand up, you're in the list, as it were, you're coming. Anybody else in this room, we're working down the road, so you've got time to get all those questions in if you're brief.
Yeah. Hi. So I think there's a danger in some of the talks so far that we're running together two different things. So on the one hand, there's arguments against kind of legally sanctioning forms of speech. And then there's this kind of separate question, which is relevant to your journal, which is like positive arguments in favor of like advocating a certain viewpoint. And yeah, I mean, I think these two things come apart in certain contexts. So for example, one argument against legally prohibiting a form of speech could be, it leads to forms of chilling effects. Other people will stop like uttering statements which, are in fact lawful. But it seems to me, that doesn't justify, that doesn't make it the case that when you're uttering something, you're justified in doing so. At most, it kind of justifies a sort of right to do wrong. So I wonder if, in some of these harder cases of speech which might, cause forms of like severe psychological harm, might be like an affront to, the dignity of people. We might have strong reasons not to legally prohibit this speech, but, there might be kind of a lower bar for assessing, whether we ought to be, kind of condoning or like amplifying those sorts of speech acts. So, if that's the case, then I worry that some of the arguments that you appeal to, against legally prohibiting speech actually fail to justify, the purpose of the journal, right, which is to amplify, which is to amplify speech.
So I think you're saying there's really two criteria because there are two different things going on in our remarks, because you were focusing on academic speech and I was mostly talking about free speech and what should legally be prohibited or not. So I think, I would agree that there are different standards, and certainly the question of what you should prohibit is limited, and the question of what should be published, we're agreeing is different, because Francesca and I are both, we're talking about peer-reviewed articles. So there is a certain standard of rigor of argument and accuracy of presenting evidence that clearly applies for the Journal of Controversial Ideas and for academic work in general. So there's that distinction. I'm not sure whether that captures your question or not. But yeah,
okay, so there are quite a few people still wanting to ask questions. I'm not sure if my methodology is going to allow everybody, but could you just put your hand up now if you're in the front 3 rows and you want to ask a question? Okay, so can we move quite rapidly through those questions, please?
So I think that I want to support kind of a question that you had a few minutes ago. It seems like on the one hand, if I publish something, or if I say it publicly, I should be able to say it in the classroom. But on the other hand, in the classroom, there's a kind of a confinement situation. It's an environment, so by saying something in the classroom or flying a swastika shaped pride flag in the classroom, I have a confined group of people, I'm creating a hostile environment. Right? If I say that on X or in the journal or in the public park, people can walk away from it. And to me, that would mean that there are some constraints that might apply within the classroom, specifically in protection of students that don't apply generally, so that we may be absolutist on free speech sort of outside of the classroom, but maybe not. If we're creating a hostile environment within the classroom, it's a different story.
Can we just take give everybody a chance to speak and then maybe respond to
I'll
everybody
try.
we want
Oh, all right, we'll take notes. Okay.
It's very quick, very brief.
Right. This is not about free speech. I mean, assuming free speech. I think there's a actually positive value, which is connected to the journal in actually generating controversial ideas. I think we have a natural, within the philosophy profession and more broadly, there's a tendency for conservatism, there's a tendency to be careful and not to go on a limb. And I think a lot of the progress that philosophy has made beyond the thales and everything is water is through willing to stake out controversial ideas. And I think it's actually positive to encourage that.
So I just wanted to make a quick note about peer review. I ask a question about that. It's just not true that academic freedom allows individuals to research whatever they want and be part of the academy. Right? Holocaust denialism would not be welcomed in a history department. Creationism and denial of evolution would not be welcomed in a biology department. So I guess the question is, what exactly is peer review doing? And Peter, you just said something about, you want to have good empirical foundations and rigor, but I wonder if there isn't something more to it. Consider someone who wanted to argue that racism was appropriate because racial tribalism is inherently good. And they didn't cite utilitarian reasons for that. They cited the long history of racial tribalism in, humanity. And, would that be not rigorous? Or is it just failing to pick up on the norms that we accept?
A couple of people have raised the point about hard cases. So just to draw on the distinction between personal morality and social sanction. So it seems like the appropriate social sanction is, you shouldn't be inciting harm. But then when it comes to personal morality, perhaps you shouldn't say something offensive. The LGBT swastika. Okay, so you shouldn't be charged with that, but also personally you shouldn't do it because you're needlessly causing offense.
Well, I thought that this was supposed to be about McMahan, so I'm bringing Jeffrey back. I just want to say that as a graduate student, I had rare ideas, and some of my ideas I couldn't share with fellow graduate students. I couldn't share with my default advisor. I couldn't share with anybody, but I could always share it with Jeff.
Thank you. You answer the last question.
Thank you. It just struck me that academics are in the business of kind of restricting content either for reasons of relevance or for competence all the time. And then speaking about or thinking about competence or truth, at least as it pertains to philosophy and other fields, well, that might be contestable to some extent. So my question was going to be generally, well, we might think the freedom to pursue academic research in various ways just kind of naturally includes a prerogative to exclude certain kinds of content. And given the nature of the contestability of the content, I just thought it was something worth considering.
Thank you. So maybe you could just have a brief response to anything you want to say there, but not very brief, because we're on the dot of half.
I'm sorry I couldn't fully understand some of the questions because English is my second language, if you notice. So some of you were speaking very quickly and I couldn't really follow. So I apologize for that. But I think Melinda was saying there is a difference between what goes in the class and what I can say in the public square. Yes, I think so, because like when you speak in the class or when you publish an article, you're speaking as an expert. So that's, you have peer review, you studied that, you are the authority on that, and you have a different responsibility. When I'm not speaking as an expert, like, I'm talking about like which exercise is going at the gym. I'm not an expert, like going to the gym, but I'm not an expert. Then, I don't have the same responsibility to really stick to the truth. When I talk about bioethics, which is my area, I have a different kind of responsibility because people will listen to me, I hope, kind of knowing I'm an expert on the topic. So I think that makes a difference. What do we do with Holocaust denial and papers that, what kind of argument that would be? I don't know what kind of argument that would be, but if somebody comes with a good paper, with good arguments, I can't think of any good argument on the top of my head, but if somebody has a good argument, I'm going to publish the paper. I don't care how controversial it is. If there is a good argument, then it's up there for people to discuss, and maybe we'll get closer to the truth. Maybe the people who have good, there's another thing we didn't mention. If you don't really air these kind of controversial ideas, like if you keep them in this kind of bubble, they really ferment and become more violent and more dangerous. So I think it's a good idea, it's a good fact that people actually share their controversial and sometimes even crazy ideas in the public sphere.
Yes, English is my first language, but I might have missed some points as well, because they were fairly quick. Yeah, about what Melinda said about the classroom, I agree it's different from what you can say elsewhere, because you don't want to create a hostile atmosphere in the classroom. You are in a position of power to some extent over your students, so you have to be careful. But that's not in terms of the content of the ideas, it's in terms of the way you say them, I think. And I think it ought to be possible to discuss in a serious and maximally non-offensive manner as far as the content allows, the variety of controversial ideas. Holocaust denial, I take it, historians will not take seriously because the evidence is just so overwhelming. But if somebody did somehow discover that there was like massive fraud and that all of those people who disappeared, including two of my grandparents, actually, that somehow they had migrated to China and you could find them there. So, maybe it would emerge. As for arguments about racial tribalism being good, we have actually published a paper on what's called enlightened tribalism, which seems to be a little bit like what you were suggesting. So maybe you should go and have a look at that article and see whether you think we shouldn't have published it. And yes, academics are always excluding some kinds of content because we have limited time and limited interest, and there are certain things we find interesting and others not. But I think that's a bit different from having areas that an academic is working on, wants to writes up and produces good arguments, and as Francesca says, then can't get it published because it's considered too controversial.
So thank you for a very stimulating session.